Mike, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes, so we just ask that you please settle into your seats and silence all your cell phones. At the end of the program, there's going to be a Q&A session, so we ask that before you state your question, you state your name and affiliation and ask a brief question. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon. I'm president of the Center for American Progress, and I want to welcome all of you to this incredibly important conversation on the future of higher education. I think we can all agree that a good education serves as a basic building block for achieving future success. And today, as globalization and technology continue to transform our economy, the value of earning a college degree or other higher education may be more important than ever. We need to make sure that America's workforce is ready to meet the demands of the 21st century. But right now, far too many people, the opportunity to get a college education is slipping out of reach. During the past decade, the price of attending a public college education has skyrocketed by 31% when adjusted for inflation. So it should come as little surprise that the total amount of student debt in the United States now exceeds $1.5 trillion, and that every year roughly 1 million Americans default on their student loans. To make matters even worse, it is Americans of color, the same communities who have been overlooked throughout our history, who still face the greatest level of adversity in this system. In fact, CAP has found that over a 3-year period alone, the racial opportunity gap in our education system has meant that more than 1 million people of color did not receive a 4-year degree. So it is crystal clear that our country must make sustained and powerful commitments towards addressing the current crisis in American higher education. We need bold action that can provide an affordable and quality education to people of every age, race, and background who want to continue their education after high school, whether that means getting a certificate from a technical school, graduating with a 4-year college degree, or something in between. And once these folks finish school, we need to give them a fair shot at finding a career that allows them to make a decent living and at building a life that's free from the burden of crippling student debt. That is why CAP is so proud to welcome all of you here for this event, and I hope you will join the conversation online using hashtag Murray HEA, MURRAYHEA. Later in the program, we will hear from a panel of distinguished experts who are striving to make our higher education system stronger and fairer for every student. But first, I have the great honor of introducing today's keynote speaker, Senator Patty Murray. Ever since she became known as a preschool teacher and mom in tennis shoes who is willing to challenge the political establishment in her home state of Washington, Senator Murray has made fighting for women and working families the very center of her agenda. She has stood as a fierce advocate for expanding access to health care and closing the gender pay gap. And earlier this week, she introduced a bill that would make major new investments toward affordable child care and early learning all throughout America. As ranking member of the Senate Education Committee, Senator Murray will also play a leading role in reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, one of the most important federal laws which governs the critical issues we are discussing this afternoon. So we're incredibly grateful that she could be here to talk about her vision for the HEA moving forward. So please help me give a warm welcome to Senator Patty Murray.
Well, Nira, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is great to see such an amazing group here today. Thanks to the Center for American Progress for hosting this really important conversation about how we increase equity and opportunity in higher education. You know, the opportunity to reauthorize our nation's landmark higher education law doesn't come around very often. So in order to make a lasting impact on the next generation of students, it's really important that we get this right. It's been over 10 years since the last reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and today's students are coming from very different circumstances and are entering a completely different economy and society than the students of 2008. Students like Joshua, he's a young guy I met recently in Vancouver in the right Washington. That would be my home state of Washington, the better Washington. Joshua earned college credit through a dual enrollment program before he graduated from high school. But knowing he still could not afford a four-year degree right away, he took a full year off to work and save for college. He is now back in school working toward his bachelor's, but he can only attend part-time because, like so many students today, he cannot afford the high cost of college without working significant hours. Or Angela. She recently shared her experience with me of being a single mom while pursuing higher education. It took Angela 5 years to earn her bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. She started at a community college and later transferred to a four-year university while also working full-time. She used a combination of scholarships and grants and work study to pay for her degree and finance the rest with student debt, all while trying to balance her day-to-day family financial responsibilities. And now Angela is working to earn her doctorate in aerospace engineering. But her research stipend, her loans, her child care subsidy for her daughter, and what's left of her savings aren't enough to make ends meet. At times, she told me she's been forced to add crushing hours of work on the side and even sell family heirlooms just to get by. Now, Angela hopes to one day build advanced rocket systems for interplanetary space travel and human exploration missions. We shouldn't hold her back from that dream because she's struggling right now to support herself and her daughter. We need her to be able to do this as a country. Or there's Lakota. She's a single mom. She's determined to break the cycle of poverty on an Indian reservation, who picked up her two daughters to move to a college campus far away on the other side of the country. And after 2 years, she realized her education was really lacking for her a sense of family and cultural understanding. So she moved again and transferred to a tribal college several states away to pursue a degree that values her heritage and incorporates her native culture into her program of study. I have heard from so many varying students like Joshua and Angela and Lakota on the complex issues that impede students from succeeding in higher education. And it is very clear we cannot waste this opportunity to reauthorize the Higher Education Act by only addressing the simple issues or easier issues and picking up just a few bipartisan bills and leaving all the hard stuff on the table. Students across the country are working hard and holding up their end of the bargain. So we need to write a law that strengthens federal investments in our students, supports and incentivizes states to reinvest in higher education, and ensures students have access to an education of value and graduate with high-quality certificates and degrees that help them succeed. in today's workforce and society. And one point that cannot be left out of this conversation is that one of the key roles the federal government should play in higher education is to help address the inequities in our society, including based on race, ethnicity, and income, and to provide opportunities so every student who works hard, no matter where they come from, their gender, their color of skin, or how much money they make, is able to succeed in this country. That was the original intent of the Higher Education Act when it was signed more than 50 years ago. So as Chairman Alexander and I, along with our other House and Senate colleagues, work on reauthorizing this law, we have to address the widening opportunity and equity gaps in higher education in this reauthorization. So with that in mind, I wanted to lay out for you 4 key priorities today that I believe an HEA reauthorization must address in order to ensure equity and give students the opportunity to succeed. They are improving college affordability, holding schools accountable for student success, expanding access to higher education, and increasing campus safety and protecting students' civil rights. Now, these just aren't my priorities. Those are students' priorities. And here is my vision for each. Number 1, making college more affordable. It is important to note when we talk about college affordability, there are 2 separate but equally important issues at hand. We need to make college more affordable for current and future students, and we also need to help the 44 million student loan borrowers manage that $1.5 trillion in debt they owe. So first, making college affordable for students. Today's students are being asked to pay more for college than previous generations, with less financial support. This is something near and dear to my heart as someone who is only able to go to college thanks to federal support, including the predecessor to what is now known as Pell Grants. I wouldn't be here today without that. But the maximum Pell Grant today covers just 1/4 of the cost of attending public four-year colleges, down from half the cost in the 1980s. This means many low-income students are forced to heavily rely on loans to fill in that gap. Nearly 60% of Pell Grant recipients take out loans, whereas only about 1/4 of those students who do not need or receive Pell borrow loans. And Pell alone doesn't tell the full story. Students of color are more likely to borrow in greater amounts, and are less likely to be able to pay down their debt compared to their white peers. The consequences are particularly severe for black students. Nearly 80% of black students borrow, and they end up having a 50-50 chance of defaulting on their student loan within 12 years of entering college. Now, this wasn't always the case. Higher education used to swing open those doors of opportunity and allow people to join the middle class. And we cannot turn into a society where the rich go to college while working families are funneled into low-quality programs or shut out of college altogether. Everyone who wants to go to college, whether it's a 2- or a 4-year degree, should have the choice to do so and should not be saddled with debt as a result. So in order to address this, our HEA reauthorization must include a state-federal partnership to promote new investments in our students and families and to pave affordable pathways to higher education. And we should increase investments in need-based aid like the Pell Grants or the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, or SEOG, and work-study. We also need to address the total cost of college, not just tuition, but food and textbooks and housing and transportation and childcare and more. It's become increasingly clear that the cost of living is the cost of college, and that many students are struggling just to meet their most essential and basic needs. And yes, we can and should simplify the FAFSA. But any student will tell you, while that's helpful, it does not do enough to address the challenges they face affording college. And secondly, we need to address that student debt crisis in our country. Student debt, as you've heard, has exploded to $1.5 trillion, more than credit card debt and auto loans. And of that $1.5 trillion, nearly $170 billion is in serious delinquency. More than 1 million borrowers a year are defaulting. There is real and severe financial pain out there. I've heard from students like a woman named Brianne who recently graduated from college, landed her dream job. Even though she makes more than most of her age, she told me she feels like she's, quote, getting nowhere on her student loan debt because of the high interest rates. So we should, of course, simplify the student loan repayment options. But for the millions of borrowers struggling to get by, we need to provide them with real relief on student debt, not just prioritize their student loan payments over all their other expenses. We need to fix the path to loan forgiveness already laid out in federal law for students who've been cheated by their schools, for our public servants, and for those who can no longer work because of a disability. And our system of federal student loan servicing has to work for borrowers, not against them, which we know is far from the case today. We see servicing breakdowns at every servicer for all types of borrowers and at every stage of repayment, and it has to be fixed now. College affordability is an issue that gets a lot of attention, rightfully so, and many of my colleagues have strong ambitions for how we make college more affordable, from providing students the ability to graduate without debt to covering tuition and fees at public colleges, and these proposals are worthy of consideration. Now, we may not be able to achieve those bold goals in a bipartisan reauthorization this year because Republicans have to come to the table to support those ideas in order to do that. But you know what? We still have significant opportunity to make a big step in the right direction and to make a significant down payment towards providing real opportunities for future students. As we continue to have conversations about big picture proposals on higher education affordability, very important, we have to also evaluate these proposals with an equity lens and an eye towards closing our growing racial wealth gaps in this country. I'm very confident that with rigorous debate and diverse voices, we can find solutions that truly help the students who need it the most. Priority number 2, accountability. We as a country have made clear that higher education is an investment that we can and should make. Taxpayers make a substantial investment in our country's students and colleges. The question has to be, in part, what we get for it. We spend $130 billion of taxpayer dollars in loans and grants every year, not to mention the money that the students are paying themselves. And this isn't just an investment in our students, it is an investment in our economy. We are educating and preparing today and tomorrow's workers and inventors and thinkers and entrepreneurs and leaders. So it's critical that the schools are holding up their end of the bargain. And that means schools must be enrolling all types of students, including from historically underrepresented backgrounds, and support students while they are in school so they're able to complete their degree. And of course, schools must ensure students can get a job with their degree or certificate where they can both earn enough money to manage their student debt and thrive in our diverse and changing society and economy. We can create a system that lifts up expectations and supports less resourced schools while putting an end to predatory practices that leave students worse off and in financial ruin. One of the root causes of unaffordable debt is low-quality programs or colleges that churn out students or require them to take out too much debt without providing them with the support and credentials of value to get a good-paying job. We need only look at the stories of Corinthian colleges or ITT Tech or Education Corporation of America and so many other large predatory for-profit colleges to know that the HEA needs to respond to what is happening to students today. These colleges often target students of color, they target low-income students, and our veterans and military service members. And the truly predatory actors put profit before students. Even though they have ample resources, they are willing to spend little of it on educating students or ensuring the value of that certificate or degree. So we can't turn a blind eye on these institutions, and we must reject the path Secretary DeVos has taken to allow predatory actors to run rampant and to put their supporters, and in many cases their former executives, in charge of overseeing this industry. We have to all agree protecting the enormous investments students and taxpayers put into higher education is paramount. Priority 3, increasing access to higher education. Higher education, as we all know, can drastically change a person's life, and for many it has allowed them to climb a rung into the middle class and beyond. But that is only possible when the doors open and there's someone on the other side offering a helping hand. So we have to expand access to students who have been traditionally left out of higher education by enhancing federal investments and support systems that help those historically underrepresented students, including students of color, first-generation college students, student parents, homeless and foster youth, women, students with disabilities, LGBTQ students, working students, veterans, service members, and their families. A lot of people who are being left out today. And it's not just about expanding admissions. Colleges need to do more to help support students while they are in school with access to peer mentoring or providing counseling to help them navigate financial aid and get academic support and career counseling. Connecting students with food and housing benefits. Can't tell you how many students I have talked to that are living in their car in a parking lot. We have to ensure that they have a safe place to sleep and reduce the cost of textbooks and supplies. Textbooks, I got to tell you, are out of control, and we have to address that. And for students with disabilities, colleges need to invest in the additional support and services they need to get an education. And finally, there are a lot of schools focusing specifically on serving historically underrepresented students, including community colleges, HBCUs, tribal colleges, Hispanic-serving colleges, and other minority-serving institutions. Too often, these schools are asked to do more with less and have not received equal resources in the past due to a legacy of discrimination or a lack of prioritization by states or the federal government. So our HEA reauthorization this time has to do more to support those schools with the resources they need to educate students. And my fourth and final priority, improving campus safety and protecting student civil rights. Schools are responsible for ensuring all students are safe, no matter their race or religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability status. That doesn't mean that difficult conversations can't be had. The exchange of ideas is a critical part of our higher education system. But no student should have to face harassment or discrimination or assault. One of my top priorities in this HEA reauthorization is to address the epidemic of sexual assault on college campuses across the country. 1 in 5 women and nearly 1 in 18 men experience sexual violence in college. I've heard from survivors who felt their school did not do enough or act quickly, who were re-traumatized every time they saw their attacker, or who were even forced to go to class with their attacker, and even those who ultimately dropped out of a school as a result. Unfortunately, rather than listen to these survivors and meaningfully address this crisis, Secretary DeVos has taken steps once again to sweep campus sexual assault under the rug. Her proposed rule would weaken protections for students and not allow schools to shirk their responsibility to protect students. Now, I have voiced my opposition to these rules loud and clear, and notably, over 100,000 students submitted comments to Secretary DeVos on this harmful proposal as well. So I got to tell you, I hope Secretary DeVos listens to them. She should scrap this disastrous proposal and work with students and survivors and advocates to come up with a solution that really does help our students. I'm going to keep pushing her to do that while we work towards this HEA reauthorization. And in addition to campus sexual assault, we also have to address discrimination on campuses. Students are facing a lot of challenges in higher education today, from affording college to managing their student debt to earning a degree that will help them, even accessing college altogether. So they shouldn't have an even harder time because of who they are or the color of their skin or how they learn. And finally, we need to take a serious look at bullying, harassment, and hazing. Over the last few years, we have heard stories of students taking drastic measures because of being bullied, including, tragically, suicide, and stories of tragic deaths as a result of hazing. A single death is unacceptable, and colleges and universities must start taking their responsibilities to keep students safe seriously. So those are my 4 priorities, and I'm really pleased that Chairman Alexander and I have begun working on good faith negotiations to really tackle these issues. Chairman Alexander and I, as you know, have a long history of working on tough issues together and getting to a result that works for our members in the Senate, and I hope that this is the next of many of those efforts. But as we move forward, it's so important we do this right. We need to bring in the voices of students, that we tackle the big, complex issues, and that we listen to each other and keep working at it even when we don't see eye to eye. We have to negotiate a comprehensive reauthorization that truly addresses the full spectrum of issues students are facing today. I know the House is working as well under the strong leadership of Chairman Scott. He's working with Ranking Member Fox, and I will work closely with them as we go through this process. And I will be making it very clear to Chairman Alexander that if we want an actual result here, a bill signed into law, we need to work in the Senate in a way that allows for ultimate passage in the House. To work any differently would simply be an exercise that leads nowhere. I am ready to get to work, and I hope everyone in this room will share their ideas to address the big challenges we have in higher education today. But before I finished, I've talked a bit about how education can open doors, and I want to share my family's higher education story with you. I really think it's a model of how our country is supposed to work. You see, my dad was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was in high school, and he couldn't work any longer. My family had to go on food stamps to get by. My mom enrolled in a program to get her accounting degree with 7 kids at home, and she got it done in 2 years. And my 6 brothers and sisters and I, we all worked in and pitched in to help make ends meet. And after my mom got her degree, she was able to help all 7 of us pursue higher education and get college degrees. And we were able to go to college with the help of federal programs like Pell Grants and student loans and work study and the support we needed to make it through. In short, our country was there for us when we needed it. It provided us with a support network, and all 7 of us graduated from college and went on to become an attorney, a firefighter, a Microsoft innovator, a teacher, a stay-at-home mom, a sports writer, and a U.S. Senator. It was a pretty good investment our country made. But when I look at our country today, our students are not being provided that same opportunity, that same ability to lift themselves up. Today's higher education system often reinforces the inequity in our society, and federal investments can either close or widen those divides. The choice is up to us. So I leave it in your hands for a great discussion. I want to thank all of you for coming today and participating in this conversation about how we can make sure that we reinforce opening those doors and providing that support. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben Miller. I run the higher education team here at the Center for American Progress and really appreciate you all joining us. I'm just going to spend very, very quick introductions on our panel and then we'll get to it. So immediately to my right is Zakiya Smith-Ellis. She is the Secretary for Higher Education in the state of New Jersey. Prior to that, she was at Lumina Foundation as well as stints in the White House and the U.S. Department of Education. To her right is Emmanuel Guillory, who is the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs at UNCF. Prior to that, he worked in the U.S. House of Representatives for Representative Virginia Foxx when she was the chairwoman of the U.S. House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And to his right is Amy Leighton, who is the Director of Higher Education at New America, who also previously worked at the White House and the U.S. Department of Education. So, we just heard Senator Murray touch on 4 key themes, and I want to spend some time digging in particular to the first three. And I say this not to sort of in any way discount the fourth, but just to recognize sort of the expertise we have on the panel. And so, Zaki, I thought I'd start with you and on the issue of affordability. You know, one of the things we heard emphasized very strongly there was the need for some sort of federal-state partnership to deal with affordability issues. And you know, as someone who is in a state and who is thinking about these issues, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about kind of what you think something like that might mean for the efforts that you're working on in New Jersey.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I was sitting there like, you know, when you're dancing, but you have to be, you know, dignified. I was like, yes, 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 federal-state partnership, because having worked on the federal side and now at the state, I just don't think there is a way forward to actually make college affordable for students that does not engage states to encourage them to fund higher education. As a state, and we're all in states except for us right now, sitting in Washington, D.C., but, you know, statehood forever. So we're all essentially in this nation in states which, where the majority of students are attending public colleges, and the fact that on average, if you look at state funding of higher education, of public higher education per student, state funding has kind of stagnated while student enrollment has increased. That means per student, you've actually seen a decline. And when you adjust for inflation, just take the state of New Jersey in the past 10 years, seen a 33% decline in per student funding. So that means that we are in a precarious state, and really the governor is excited about higher education. We've got a new administration, and we're doing some interesting things around free community college, which she didn't necessarily mention, but I know is another proposal that's sitting out there in terms of affordability. But those things are very difficult to do without kind of some federal support. And as a state, you know, you're doing the right thing. You're, you know, making investments and increases while somebody, you know, across the river or down the street is kind of getting the same thing from the federal government without having to do anything. So when I think about it from the federal side, though, I just feel like you're not leveraging the Pell Grant, the investment in student loans, and you're getting kind of markedly different results from different states, and you're doing the same thing in every state without kind of leveraging that buying power that comes from the huge federal investment. And so I just feel like that's something that should be of bipartisan interest, right? Like both sides of the aisle should want to make sure that they're not kind of throwing good money after bad and really getting something more meaningful from that investment in student aid.
Emmanuel, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the access portion of this. You know, we heard Senator Murray talk in particular about the need to be doing more to support institutions that are serving large numbers of students who historically have not necessarily had those doors open to them in higher education. I know that, you know, your organization represents, I believe, 37 private historically black colleges and universities that really are doing that key work and have that key mission. I wonder if you could sort of talk about what some of what she's outlined there in terms of broadening access and increasing support that would mean for your schools.
Absolutely. So UNCF, we do represent 37 member HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. Our student demographic is made up of majority Pell Grant students. So over 70% of our students are on the Pell Grant. And Senator Murray mentioned the Higher Education Act of 1965. So the whole point of that bill was to increase access to post-secondary education. And I don't think that anyone in this room can deny that access has been increased. There are more options for students to go to, that sort of thing. But now the conversation is shifting a little bit more to completion and to make sure that students are accessing a quality education. Because overall, we want to make sure that students are able to get the jobs that they are going to school to actually receive. So unfortunately, when we look at that, we all know that when a student obtains a degree, the higher the degree, the higher the earning potential. So the Bureau of Labor and Statistics tells us that for a high school diploma, if that's all that you have, then you can expect to make around $720 on an average earnings weekly. If you have a bachelor's degree, you can expect to make $1,173. Now, that's standard if we look at everyone involved. However, there are equity issues within that, which is unfortunate. So when we actually break it down, the median weekly earnings for blacks is $712 and Hispanics $684. And that's working full-time jobs in whites, compared to whites, is $931. And actually Asians is $1,095. So when we break that down by sex, that changes even more. So black men are earning $773 compared to white men who are earning $1,024. And then when we break it down even more, you have black women who are earning $665 compared to white women who are earning $816. So that's just an example of some of the struggles that we face, but when it comes to access to post-secondary education, we want to make sure that is of quality. And I think there's a conversation being had on the House and the Senate side regarding what happened in the triad system. You know, what role does the accreditors have? Are we looking at outcomes now more so than inputs? And what is the federal government? What is their role in state licensing and that sort of thing? But at UNCF, we do advocate and provide scholarship assistance to students to further their education and subsidize their education. We have raised over $4.8 billion since our inception in 1944. We have over 400 scholarship programs. We award $100,000 annually to 10,000 students to over 1,000 institutions. And so that is a core mission, and I'm happy to talk about that further as we continue to discuss this.
So I do want to touch on accountability. Amy, I know this is something you've done a lot of work on, and something that Senator Murray emphasized very strongly is ensuring that we get what we pay for. And I'm curious if you could just sort of do a little bit of kind of what's not good enough level today, and what do we really need to be doing better here.
Yeah, so I will say, first of all, I'm super excited. I was doing scribbles, doing a little dance side. I'm trying to yes, really loud. I can't on the stage. But here, Senator Murray not just uses the word accountability, but actually make it one of four priorities. It's incredibly important and powerful, and I think a big shift in terms of where we've been in the higher ed conversation. Because to your question, the higher education is largely unaccountable to anyone. It's not to students who don't have the information they need to make informed choices, not to states or accreditors, who, depending on the state and depending on the accreditor, ask very little in terms of outcomes, which Emmanuel just referenced, and not to the feds, who really ask very little other than a default rate that is really, really low and that is really rarely enforced. So I agree with Senator Murray that it's time to sort of ask for a little bit more for what we're getting in this $130 billion a year in federal aid, much of which goes out in the forms of loans to students. So, and we've seen the need for accountability, certainly this week, and and before, and Senator Murray talked about in the for-profit sector, in terms of, and we've seen that this week. Federal money has propped up schools that have harmed thousands of students, and it shouldn't do that. But expectations need to be higher across the entire higher ed system. While it is true that higher education is worth it on average, students aren't going to average schools and paying average prices and getting average outcomes. And there are real equity consequences and unequal distribution of who's getting which types of outcomes. And it's nice to see that I think both parties are really starting to recognize that there are real risks to students of going to college. There are risks, especially when they're borrowing for it, risks of not completing, risks of not making a living wage, risks of not making enough to comfortably pay down their loans. And I think what's really important in this conversation, which is why the word accountability matters, is that it's not just the student's fault. What institutions do and don't do matters, and federal policy should reflect that. So I think this conversation is really important. But it's also really hard, right? It's hard both sort of technocratically and it's hard politically. Colleges are really important, powerful constituents, and making sure college is worth it sounds really good until you run the numbers and then you realize, oh crap, there are real colleges serving real students in real members of Congress's districts. And so there are going to be institutional winners and losers in accountability. And we don't want losers, or at least we don't want institutional losers. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be thinking about, is we need to be focusing on students rather than on the institutions. And so this push for accountability, I think, is really important. And I do think that we've heard, both from Senator Murray and I think from Senator Alexander, there really is interest and openness and some accountability around schools with poor repayment outcomes. And I think that's an encouraging first step, and I think it'll be interesting to see if they can sustain that support through the legislative process, and then if it goes through the legislative process in the implementation side.
Great. I do want to pick up on one thing you just said there about, one of the challenges with accountability is you sort of have these winners and losers. And
Yep.
do you think there are things you could do in an accountability system to sort of make what happens to losers more palatable, or make it so that it's something that is actually doable? I mean, I think we saw this with Salvador Alexander. I assume that was part of his rationale for going to program level accountability. But I'm curious, do you think there are other things that could be done here to consider that?
I mean, first of all, I think obviously we need to be careful, and we need to be slow, and we need to be thoughtful, and we also shouldn't assume malintent, right? So I think trying to give schools opportunities, I don't want to give schools a free pass, but also want to make sure that schools are given the support they need in terms of data, in terms of technical assistance, in terms of other resources to help students succeed, right? Because there's some schools who just, there may be some schools who really don't have students' best interests in mind at all, okay? And we've seen some of that. And I think, if the deregulatory agenda of the DeVos administration is going down, I know a side sort of goes down, I think we'll see more of those. But I think, for the most part, I think institutions really are trying to do well by their students, but they don't necessarily have the support, and support isn't just money, but it can be money in a variety of ways. And so I think thinking about how to incent that and how to support schools, not giving them a pass, but making sure that they get what they need to help students, which is the most important thing.
And I would actually add to that, the thing that I heard that was really heartening and that Amy just mentioned is having a student's first outcome. And I think every institution cares, should care about their students. And if they don't, we should be asking them to care about their students. So when you say, what is the outcome for students? Emmanuel just mentioned, are students actually getting jobs? When I talk to students, as part of our state process, we're developing a plan for higher education, and we've gone across the state and talked to, many hundreds of students, and then did a survey where over 10,000 individuals, half of which were students, came back. They care about affordability for one, but they also care about relevance. They're really concerned about the ability to get a good job, and it's not an irrational concern because we've put the burden on them in terms of student loans. So when you kind of think about it that way, we owe it to the students, given the system of financing that we have set up, to be concerned about whether they are going to be able to make it based on this promise. And we've had this conversation before when I was at the federal level. If you are doing an entire system of, I won't even say affordability, but just financing system, and you base it on an individual's loan, then you are essentially saying that you think that education is going to allow them to repay that. That is point blank what you've said. Otherwise, you would set it up some other way. If you, cared about, you could set it up as a bond that's paid back by the residents of the state. There's all kinds of financing schemes that aren't individual loans, but the only reason you would do individual loans is because you think the education is something that they're going to get that increases their earning potential. So in some ways, I feel like the conversations that we have about whether institutions are or not about work, it's we can choose a different financing system. But the one that we have chosen necessitates that if we care about the outcomes of students, that we critically rethink and test our own, kind of understanding of what's possible to make sure that students are okay. And they end up being borrowers to make sure borrowers are okay.
So to piggyback on that, I wanted to highlight one statistic. Persons of color are employed at lower rates with a bachelor's degree or higher compared to their white peers. For example, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, a total of those employed who received a bachelor's degree or higher in January through October of 2017 was 1.3 million. Of these individuals, 983,000 were white compared to 98,000 who were black, 167,000 who were Asian, and 144,000 who were Hispanic or Latino. Striking statistic, right? But something else that I wanted to enter into this conversation is, as far as institutions are concerned, we have to make sure that they have what they need to also be successful and educate our students to go out and get those jobs that they desire to have. So when it relates to historically black colleges and universities, we tend to be more under-resourced institutions, unfortunately. So we rely a little bit more heavily on federal, state, and local funding in comparison with non-HBCUs, and that's 54% overall revenue versus 38%. Private HBCUs actually depend a little bit more on tuition dollars than their non-HBCU counterparts. That's 45% compared to 37%. Private gifts, grants, and contracts constitute a smaller portion, actually, of overall revenue at private HBCUs compared to their non-HBCU counterparts, and that's 17% versus 25%. And public and private HBCUs experienced the largest declines in federal funding per full-time equivalent student between 2003 and 2015. So if HBCUs were able to have access to more dollars in a fair manner, then HBCUs would be able to, you know, take on more students, educate more students, and help more students, help the community overall. But it's not about HBCUs, it's about all institutions at hand. I think that we want to make sure that we're allowing institutions to be able to be innovative, to be able to think outside the box, to be able to find creative ways to get students to and through college with the least amount of debt possible so they can achieve their American dream, whatever the case may be. And so I want to make sure that we're looking at both sides of the coin as we have this conversation.
So I want to pick up on the last thing you said and then get back to the thing you said just before that. So I'm curious, there is this big push and this big discussion on sort of innovation as a thing we need to be doing. And I'm curious, sort of as you're talking about needing to free that up a little bit more, are there certain things that come to mind that you would like to see change, or are there certain types of learning that aren't happening, or just talk a little bit more about kind of what you're looking for there?
So I guess right now there are lots of conversations about this. I know the Department of Education is doing negotiated rulemaking right now called Accreditation and Innovation, and looking at ways to allow institutions to be more innovative as it relates to the definition of a credit hour and how that's assessed, and the ability to partner with other organizations and to offer different experiences for students, and to be able to use their Title IV funds outside the campus, but through contractual agreements, of course. And I would say that in any way that we can help the student be as successful as possible, then that is the overall end goal, but not also at the harm of the institution. But right now, institutions, they have to abide by a number of different rules and regulations that can seem a little bit burdensome, and it's a lot of red tape, and everyone wants to make sure everyone is doing the best job possible. But innovation does not mean lack of quality. I am not saying that we should support innovation and have that be, you know, lackluster. We want to make sure that students are able to have access to a quality education to help them get a job, but at the same time, we want to think more about ways that we can allow institutions to do that. I know that there have been some proposals out there trying to touch on this in allow some greater flexibility as to how Title IV dollars are spent and what they can be spent on. Allowing for these partnerships to actually take place where an institution can partner with a company or a business, and that company or business can offer up to 100% of that program, of course, through a contractual agreement with the institution. And some of these, you know, thoughts are flying around, but I think it's a conversation that we can still have, but it's something that is necessary. Also, pay for success initiatives is something that's being discussed and could potentially be a part of the higher education space as we move forward and have this discussion too.
You know, one of the things that we heard Senator Murray emphasize a lot too is the importance to really consider equity in all the areas we're talking about, and that sort of, you know, she used talking about opening doors and emphasized it repeatedly. I'm curious, sort of, as you think down your own lists or your organization's lists or your state's lists of sort of, you know, what you're hoping to see out of this HEA, like what is at the top of that list when you put an equity lens on it to say, like, we think this would do the most to close those gaps or open those doors?
Well, I will say, and maybe this isn't fair, but I actually think there's a lot, you won't be surprised to hear me say there's a lot that a federal-state partnership could do. And that's because states are so intricately involved in higher education in many ways, and including kind of supporting whether they're public HBCUs, and they should be, maybe that could be an element of, for some of the states that have HBCUs in their districts or in their states, that could be an element of what you think about. You could hold states accountable through some kind of federal-state partnership for the work that they do to increase access and support for underrepresented students within the states or low-income students within the state. We're a state that spends a great deal on state financial aid, which helps low-income second-time students, students who are first in their family. We also have state student support programs. I'm just thinking about all of the things that that happen that you could integrate into a robust program, in addition to the things that the federal government does to support students through whether it's TRIO or Gear Up or support to MSIs, including HBCUs. We have predominantly Black and Hispanic serving institutions in New Jersey, but not historically Black colleges and universities. And those contribute to the fabric of our students. But there are also things that we could be doing at a state level to increase access and equity that I think we are doing or will be doing in many ways. But that should be encouraged and supported through the federal government and the activities of the federal government. So I think that has a lot of promise, and that's high on my list. I just think we will have a huge missed opportunity if you don't do that. Like if we have an HEA reauthorization and you don't engage states in it, I just feel like, to her point, like we waited 10 plus years to do something meaningful for students, and I just don't see how you'll be able to, unless, you know, maybe the federal government will just be like, states, you don't even have to do anything. We've got it all. You know, you could spend your money on Medicare and, you know, all other kind of stuff, because we're just going to fund everything with higher ed, which would be a wholly different ballgame, but also an interesting conversation if the appropriators came through on that.
Over under on that happening?
Okay. Yeah.
You want me to go? So you probably won't be surprised to know that I think one of the biggest opportunities we have in this reauthorization in terms of equity is improving the data that we have, because you can't address equity gaps if you can't see them. And right now, we have huge data gaps in terms of which institutions are serving which students in which programs and which price as well. And for example, we have College Scorecard has some earnings data on students who receive Title IV. 75% of California community colleges are missing from that. One of the biggest, if not the biggest. David, is it the biggest system or the second biggest system in the world? I don't remember if California is the biggest or second biggest, but it is a huge community college system, and we only capture 25% of the students in our federal data. So understanding, and huge numbers of students of color there. So we need to have better data so we can see the equity gaps. And it's very encouraging. I think this is one of the areas of real bipartisan agreement. Senator Alexander, in his comments 2 weeks ago at AEI, spoke about the College Transparency Act. Senator Murray was very interested in this as well. And I mean, it really is such bipartisan support. You have on the left, you have Elizabeth Warren. On the right, you have Joni Ernst. I mean, there's really very little that is that bipartisan in DC. So I think that's huge. So I'm a true believer in data. Can't address equity gaps unless and until you have data. But it's also not enough. The data can help us diagnose problems, but then we need targeted solutions to the students who are struggling the most. And we can have universal policies for some things, and that's great, but sometimes universal policies are regressive. We need targeted interventions to the students who are struggling the most, and right now that's Black borrowers and non-completers.
So when it relates to data, one thing that we do know is that the 6-year completion rate right now is 53.8%. For the fall 2012 cohort, and for the 8-year completion rate is 60.4% for the fall 2010 cohort. But the 6-year completion rate for fall 2012 cohort for Black students is 47.6% and 57.4% for Hispanic students at 4-year public institutions. So that's something that we know, and that tells me that clearly students of color are completing less. And so when we think about that, how can we help students, and how can we help those institutions serving those students help those students succeed, which means increase the completion rate, and then of course help them get the jobs that they are in higher education to get in the first place. So when I think about that, I think about investing in our institutions. As far as historically Black colleges and universities is concerned, there is Title III. It's the Strengthening HBCU program. It allows us to better serve our students. Mind, we are under-resourced. This stream of funding is very impactful for our institutions to help serve our students, who primarily are Black students, even though we do have students of all different racial backgrounds and makeups. And so, but also helping those students who, no matter where they go, be able to actually afford college. Something that was mentioned earlier is a federal-state partnership, which a federal-state partnership is not a bad idea. However, I would love to see exactly what that looks like and where is the money actually coming from. And if it's mandatory funds and it's within the HEA, okay, is that coming from Title IV, and are not that low-income first-generation college students would be negatively impacted, but what would that look like? And of course, is it a voluntary structure? Is it not voluntary? But the Pell Grant is essential for low-income first-generation college students. And the Pell Grant does not cover the same percentage of the cost of college as it used to. And it's due to a lack of state investment. And we are seeing more states now starting to invest a little bit more in higher ed than what they used to, but it's nowhere near the fact that the Pell Grant was covering 70% of college costs at one point in time. We're so far from that. So I think those two angles and two approaches would address our equity issues.
And can I just make a technical point that I think is important that Emmanuel brought up? You know, the funding, the HEA is an authorizing bill, and so, you know, unless you're kind of doing some interesting things with that, you know, it really just sets up a framework. But one thing that we saw in, I'm just going to go back to the time of the Obama administration when Amy and I were working on a piece of thing that we had to shoehorn in a reconciliation process. So just technically, if you don't have the underlying structure for something that you want to do within the authorizing committee, it makes it very difficult to then appropriate funds. I'm looking at budget staffers and other folks that have worked on this issue. So to me, it's really important that we create that structure for a federal-state partnership so that if we ever get funding, that it goes in there and that we're not then trying to like tie it to the College Access Challenge grant, which then isn't really the right the appropriate way to like, or I'm just thinking about whatever the TAA, CCCT that started out as the community college, you know, thing and then kind of ended up. So let's just create those structures. This is the time to have that conversation, to think about, well, what is it that you would want to hold states accountable for? How would you want to make sure that states are doing what they need to do? And to have that level of detail within the, and that's the really technical point, but I think an important one, now is the time to have that conversation so that there is a vehicle for something later. And I'm also thinking in my head about the last HEA, which had like Title VIII with a bunch of programs or whatever it was, that, like programs like Section K and all this stuff that never got appropriated. But the important point is I think if there's some understanding and bipartisan agreement that we need to move in this direction, you want to flesh out that structure here.
Can I just, sorry, now can I jump in? Just about the federal-state partnership, because I think it's, again, one of the things I'm most excited about in this. And I know it's obvious, but I feel like I'm just going to say it anyway. But like, if let's say the federal government decided in this reauthorization, which I think is unlikely, but I would like it, if they were to double the Pell Grant. That doesn't mean it's going to be more affordable for students because states are just sort of backing out. The more the feds sort of funnel in, the more the states are like, okay, I'm out, and then the feds are just funneling and funneling and funneling. And remember, what they're funneling are student loans, right? So it's not, and I love Zakia's idea that maybe we're just going to decide as a country we are going to fully fund, the federal government's going to fully fund, make affordable, high-quality education available.
Just throwing it out there. Is this the only alternative?
Like, maybe that's going to happen. I know you don't think it's really going to happen this HEA. It isn't going to happen right now. And so we do need to lay the groundwork to make sure that states are engaging and that they aren't backing out and that we aren't like continuing to load students up with more and more and more and more debt.
And I don't even, I mean, I haven't thought about it prior to me saying it here, so I probably shouldn't have said it on a live stream without thinking about what the implications are of the federal government completely funding higher ed and absolving states of their responsibility. So even if they were to do it, I don't know that it would be a good idea.
Right. I didn't say,
oh yeah, I know. I just like, if anybody's listening out there and like thinking, oh yes, we will just like kind of pull states out of it. I actually think it's positive to have that relationship.
Well, and I think part of this is the point of this process is this is the time to have these discussions about, you know, what is the federal role in higher education? What should it be striving toward? What should its goals be? And I thought it was interesting. So one of the things we heard from Senator Murray was saying, you know, the way we can do that is by having a comprehensive bill. Like she was basically saying, you can't do these big ideas, or you can't basically even debate the big ideas, even if the big ideas don't necessarily make it all the way through if you do piecemeal legislation. And I'm curious, sort of, where do each of you fall on this question of sort of the comprehensive versus the piecemeal? And briefly why, and then we'll move on to some fun other questions.
So I'll take a stab at this first. I think that ideally it's better to do a comprehensive bill over a piecemeal approach, only because when it comes to the Higher Education Act, there's money involved, right? And there are rules in Congress. And depending on who's in charge, the rules can change. So when the Republicans were in the majority, there was a cut-go rule. And so you had to abide by that every single piece of legislation. You know, if you're going to spin here, you got to cut somewhere else, and otherwise it's not going to go to the floor. I believe now with the Democrats in charge, there's the House pay-go rule. So it has to be paid for within a 10-year window at some point in time. And so with that being said, when it comes to these vital programs that touch the lives of students, which typically they all fall in Title IV of the HEA. That's a lot of mandatory funds. And so with those mandatory funds, you know, if you have a single bill that does something, okay, then how do you make sure that evens out in the long run? What's the pay for that? Or, you know, realistically getting across the finish line, what does that look like with CBO scoring it and that sort of thing? So us sitting up here, we're advocates, and we advocate for the things that we believe are right and how we think the HEA should look. But Congress, they listen to us, hopefully, but then they have to figure out how can we realistically make this happen. So when you have an overall comprehensive bill, you have more money that you can kind of play with and put here and pull there, and you can maybe do some more creative, innovative things instead of being pigeonholed if you have a different approach with isolated bills. So.
I'm waiting because I wanted to hear what Amy said before I answered.
Then I'll go. All right. So we need a comprehensive reauthorization, period. And then I'm going to say period, and then of course I'll speak more. But, excuse me, I mean, the scale of problems that we're facing, that students are facing, I'm so choked up I can't even, the idea of piecemeal is just making me choke. The scale of the problems that students are facing is huge, right? So most students don't graduate in the expected amount of time. Most aren't paying down their debts a few years after leaving college. Some are leaving programs so shoddy that they're not even earning a living wage. So this is there are huge problems, and there are so many things to do. I'll just make a little plug for New America. If you go to newamerica.org/HEA, you can see our 30 pages of recommendations. But the point is, we have 30 pages of recommendations. I bet lots of folks in this room and folks watching have so many recommendations because there is so much to do. And we can't afford to just do a few, I don't want to say unimportant things because they're important, but the scale of what we are dealing with is huge. And if we don't do some of the harder things, I think Senator Murray said this, if we don't do the hard things now, when are we going to do them? We're going to kick the can down the road for another 10 years? We're like, okay, everybody agrees on FAFSA. I would love to have FAFSA simplification, but just getting that right now, it's not enough. And it's unconscionable for members of Congress to basically say, these are harder choices. We can't figure it out. So we're just going to kick the can down the road and let another generation of students basically go through a system that we know is not working for them. So full reauthorization, there we go.
I will be the third to concur about a comprehensive bill, if for no other reason because of just the politics of compromise and negotiation. And if you know that there's a piece, and I'll just bring up the thing that I think is probably, you haven't asked us this, but the thing that is most likely going to be contentious, which is around student safety and sexual assault. I signed a letter with our Attorney General opposing the Secretary DeVos's plans to create new rules around this that would kind of, what we think is really scaling back on what many colleges and universities across the nation, but certainly in New Jersey, had really stood up systems to support students in this really comprehensive way over many years and done a lot of hard work, and then just to be like, actually, no, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to take the standard down a notch. It's just totally the wrong time in this era, at any time really, but particularly in this era. And to not have something that speaks to student safety in this moment would be like ridiculous. I just think it doesn't speak to the whole student. And so because it's hard though, and because it's difficult to throw that off, when is somebody going to pick that back up, right? If not, so it's like you can do the like fun, everybody agrees, like doesn't cost any money. And I actually can't believe I'm saying this. Information stuff, because like the fact that it's bipartisan was not always the case, and like that we had like so much energy around that. But you don't like get to do that in a vacuum over here. You also have to contend with the hard stuff about students who are facing real challenges on campus and off campus, and deal with that at the same time in the same kind of context.
So you read my mind about where I was hoping to go. So, you know, we'll hop in a time machine briefly. I get up in the morning, I open Politico or Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, or pick your outlet of choice, and I see a story that says, you know, the bill is all but done except. What are they writing that article about? And it sounds like we have your answer, so why don't we go?
Well, I would think campus safety too, but I mean, I think some of the classic issues like spending, you know, giving, are we going to spend more or less or the same on Pell Grants? Are we going to make benefits sort of more or less generous for borrowers? I think those are, you know, and I think, you know, federal-state partnership and some of the new ideas too. But yeah, you know, the tried and true.
Mm-hmm. I would say loan forgiveness would probably be a big one. Are we going to keep the public service loan forgiveness program? What does that look like? We're going to make changes to that. Are we going to keep the repayment options the same with the forgiveness tacked on as well? Interest rates might be a conversation that might be a little bit contentious. Do we keep them as they are? Do they change? And I would say how we treat for-profit institutions would probably also be something that's contentious as well, and maybe a challenge to kind of work through.
Okay, I actually have a top 4 list, and because I am very much enjoying a TV show right now where you guess, and so it's called The Masked Singer, and I didn't watch it last night, so no spoilers. It's really silly, but I really like it. So I'm going to guess, and then you could tell me like maybe 10 months from now, 10 weeks from now, when they're working on this bill, or however long we think it's going to take. PSLF, I'm going to take that. Federal-state partnership, because I didn't hear Senator Alexander talk about it. And so the fact that he kind of talked about all these other things, which were clearly things, and that was missing. Campus safety and 90-10.
Yeah.
What do I win if that happens?
We win not having a reauthorization for another 10 years, but yeah.
So what of substance? So not, we got rid of, I don't know, file sharing policies or something small, but like what of substance gets agreed to rather quickly?
Simplifying the federal financial aid process. So if that's, including the FAFSA, I think that repayment options is something that everyone's talking about and wanting to simplify. And so I would stop there. But.
Yeah, please say that. Please say that.
I think data and transparency stuff gets agreed to relatively quickly.
I would agree. I would agree.
In the Senate.
Yes, in the Senate. Look, Emmanuel's.
Well, I guess in the Senate, but in the House, there's such a Democratic majority that I don't necessarily think it.
And lots of Republican supporters,
Yeah.
So I would say those. I think those are probably the biggest ones. I think there are other things that Senator Alexander talked about, like standardizing financial aid offer letters, like some things like that. That I think again,
aid shopping sheet.
Yeah, the shopping sheet.
Maybe a Pell for incarcerated individuals.
Yeah. Oh, knock on the
Yeah. I don't think those are things that, and I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago, 1 year ago, but I think those are all things that we could see be agreed to relatively quickly. And I will say, taking my hat off here for a moment, thinking about like the immigration conversations where we have the same conversation of what's piecemeal and what, can everybody agree to. The hard thing for everyone is going to be when we agree to these things that were not things that we thought would be agreed to a year, 2 years ago, but the hard things are still left. We say we just want to take what we can get now. And even though we don't have that list of, we don't have agreement on PSLF and it has not been solidified and we haven't dealt with federal-state partnership and we don't have anything, to change 90-10 and we don't have anything on campus safety, do we take the things that everybody had worked so hard for and really excited about, or do we just say, okay, no, we're ready to, it's like the dream bill versus the comprehensive immigration one.
So I know we've asked a bunch of targeted questions that I've largely tried to direct, but I'm curious, as you think about what you heard, is there anything that you have sort of major questions on that we haven't discussed yet, whether that's student loan repayment or sort of changes to Pell, or what are you sort of most wondering to sort of see the next level of details down on?
Well, accountability.
Accountability. Like the devil is really in the details on a lot of things, but specifically accountability, risk sharing. If you don't have any mechanism for ensuring that institutions just don't bake that into the price, you're really not going to get anywhere. So how do you deal with institutions that have different student types while not letting people off the hook, acknowledging what amount of time do you treat every institution the same? Which I think boils down to, do you think the incentives, because some of the accountability stuff is really about what incentives do you think people are responding to? And I think one of the complications of the accountability conversation is that it sounds nice to treat everyone the same, and it sounds fair. But if everyone is not motivated by the same set of incentives, and if the reasons for failure, I'll just say failure to the students, if the reason for students not completing or not succeeding are different at different types of institution, then it probably means that your solutions should be different for different types of institutions. And that is a difficult thing to contend with. I would actually suggest that historical racism and systemic racism is very much the reason why you see lower completion rates at historically black colleges in many states, which have just out and out decided to fund them differently when they're both state institutions. And that is not the same as a publicly traded company that has, executives making millions of dollars, that has decided to, even though they had funds, they decided not to put them into student supports. And what you do about those problems is different. And how you address that challenge is different. I would think that, my mom is an alma mater of Bennett College. There are a lot of challenges of Bennett College right now, and one of the biggest challenges has been financial, right? And the accreditor is really looking at financial issues. And so an infusion of money, a huge set of support, I don't know that what Argosy needs right now is an infusion of cash, and that they have been bereft of cash, right? And so that just kind of thinking about the solution set when it comes to accountability is the same.
I want to hear more about the triad system and actually what Congress is thinking about strengthening and improving that. You mentioned Bennett College. Unfortunately, Bennett College did lose their accreditation, but now has it back. They are appealing that decision. But, it's been a back and forth. It's been a back and forth, and it's been challenging. And we've been hearing a lot from our member presidents that they've had some historical challenges with their regional accreditors and how they're being treated and having to go the extra mile to prove certain things that other institutional types did not have to go so far to do. And so we are still learning about the impacts that regional accreditors are having on our types of institutions. But in general, I mentioned earlier the conversation about having accreditors look more at outcomes. What does that look like? Are we really doing that? There's only 9 bright line metrics in the HEA right now. Are we going to look at increasing those? What does that look like? What level do states still play moving forward in a new HEA reauthorization bill? Does it remain the same? Is it different? So I'm curious to hear more about the roles of the triad and just kind of how it all works, and if even the department's going to do more to recognize an accreditor, what would that be? What steps does an accreditor have to take in order to gain that recognition? So.
No, I think I want to hear more about accountability, and Zakiya said
I think
really
that includes the triad too. Yeah,
it does. I mean, again, we talk about the triad as if it's a thing. I mean, it's like, but it's this game of everybody sort of touching their nose and playing not it, right? It's just your job, your job, your job, or it's more like not my job. And we need everyone to step up in this reauthorization.
But one thing that I want to make sure I say that when it comes to accountability, we need to make sure that we're not penalizing institutions that are enrolling a large number of low-income first-generation college students, because I've read stats earlier. It's clear that persons of color make less money and get employed at lower rates and complete at lower rates. So those are problems. So how do we address those problems?
Totally.
How do we fix those problems? And when you're holding institutions accountable, especially if you want to say you have a plan that just treats everyone the same, well, how is that? How's equity built into that? It has to be built into that, because otherwise you're going to see institutions not wanting to enroll students who are low income. And students who are low income are bright students. They are intelligent students. They are driven. They are motivated. The only thing that are different about these types of students is that they are in an environment that is not in their control. They couldn't help that they come from a low-income family, that they don't have the resources to depend on, to fall back on when in times of need, that they have to pay their way through college in a lot of ways because, they take out as much as they can, but, we don't want them to take out private loans per se, because that's an entirely different ball game. I am a testament of that. And so equity is so important in these conversations of accountability and making sure that institutions are being accountable, they're held accountable, but in a fair manner.
And Ed Trust has done, when you say that, I think Ed Trust has done some really interesting work, and I cannot remember is it College Results Online, the thing that they do where they look at institutions that serve the same kinds of students. So they have, looking at institutions that have this percentage of Pell, and how do institutions that have similar student types do, because we've seen instances where institutions have they're serving similar students, but their outcomes are very different. And so in the same vein of, yes, you want to support institutions, particularly those that are, most in need of support. I'm back to my point about, I'm philosophically not necessarily in support of supporting for-profit ventures. If you're you should be in the space because you think you can do a better job, not because you need government subsidy. If you need government subsidy, you should be a private or nonprofit institution. But institutions that serve the same kinds of students, and what are their outcomes? And I totally agree. You wouldn't want to hold Princeton University and Bloomfield College in the state of New Jersey to the same standard, even though they're both private institutions in the state of New Jersey.
So Zakiya is just reading my I was just want to.
I was reading the notes.
You were reading the notes. I mean, the trust report is really important, and we can't use the equity piece. Similarly situated students is a really good mechanism, because if you just sort of blame it on the student, like, oh, these poor students, they're X, they're Y, they're Z, of course they're not going to do as well, then we're not acknowledging that institutions have a role in this. If we believe that institutions matter and it's not just sort of where you're born, then we have to incent institutions. Otherwise, we could just give out degrees based
low
on
expectations.
Right, we could just give out degrees based on zip code, right? So.
Yeah.
So we're going to move to questions momentarily. We're going to do a very quick lightning round, so please get your questions ready because we'll be going there in a second. So just answer the question. We don't need an explanation. If you say something really interesting, hopefully people come up to you after and ask more. So, all right. How many questions does the FAFSA have after this process is over?
Who's going first?
We'll go this way. Amy, you can go first.
Fewer than 100? Sorry, I know that.
15.
20.
20, okay. How many repayment plans do we have?
For new borrowers, 2 to 3.
Borrowers. 2.
3.
Okay. You get a magic wand. You get one wish that guarantees a change you want for HEA gets made. What is it? But don't explain it.
Wait, what? Oh, I still have to go first?
Going down
Well, you go first.
Extended mandatory funding in Title III Part F.
Oh.
Federal-state partnership.
Federal-state partnership. Sorry, it's you.
Should we keep negotiated rulemaking in this HEA?
God, no.
Do I have to answer the question?
But you could plead the fifth.
I plead the fifth.
Okay, fair enough.
Yes.
All right, and finally, when does the next HEA pass?
You mean the one that's up for
This one.
2022?
22.
2020.
All right. So now we'll move to questions from the audience. So there should be mics coming around. Please stand up, introduce yourself, and please ask a question or I will cut you off. Yeah, there in the back. Yeah, right there.
I'm Frank Ballman with the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs, and I'd love to talk about federal-state partnerships, but we don't have time. Accountability. 30 years ago, in response to massive fraud, we introduced cohort default rate, and quickly that got gained within a few years. So now we're at HEA reauthorization. We're talking about accountability. States have 35 plus states have performance metrics, and they realize right away we have to fine tune them every year. Like graduation rates, community colleges aren't as important as, say, courses completed or credits transferred. How do you install guardrails so that we don't have a train wreck, like especially as the manual suggests, relative to accountability that leads to access problems? And if we don't reauthorize till 2035 next, that's a very long time to have a festering problem.
Well, I hear you, and I think it's slow and thoughtful, right? I think you need really good data. Like before you jump into some massive, huge accountability scheme, which I don't think would pass today anyway. But I think, we can sort of take some baby steps towards it, and I think sort of being thoughtful and having those equity gaps in mind in terms of access to make sure we're not creaming, to make sure that we're not just looking at single metrics that could be gamed, right? And so if we're just incenting completion, that it's not like, okay, then everybody just increases their completion rates, but we really do look at outcomes for, I think what Senator Murray called like credentials of value, that we look at what's happening to students and what's happening to which students, and we start to hold students or institutions accountable to a really low bar. I think the federal government is not in the position of sort of determining what is quality, but I think they can set a pretty, at least a minimum bar of what is not quality right now, and then we sort of get a sense of what needs to be happening and what interventions are working where.
I would agree, and not just to agree, but I want to challenge the notion that nothing has changed in 30 years. Or, sometimes I think we can kind of throw up our hands because we think that people will game any system. And what I would say now is we have people gaming a system. And we have people gaming a system because we have incentivized you enrolling students. And so we have seen places that have been predatory in enrolling students because you get money for enrolling students. And so I just think that it's time that we kind of shift that. And then what has happened is that's a debt finance system, so we've enrolled more students to the tune of $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, and it's mostly on the students, and they're the ones that are held accountable. So we do a very good job of holding the students accountable because we get our money at some point from them. And I just think that this is a time to to shift who is held accountable. So it's possible, it's just you have to be careful in it, and there are always unintended consequences. And I don't think we should be afraid of that, because the question is not whether or not there are any unintended consequences. The question is whether those consequences are worth it, and the whole system is better than the system that we currently have now. So not like, are there going to be some people that end up gaming it? You know that there are people that cheat on tests, and there are people that, but is it the majority of people? And by and large, is it possible to is it worth having that underlying thing, even if some people game it?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Saidi Jaz, and I work at Consumer Reports. But more relevant, I'm 24 years old, and I graduated college about 2 years ago. And I did advocacy for about 3 years on student issues, and specifically student affordability. I can personally attest to the indirect costs of college being the greatest determinant of both the quality of life while you are a student and the quality of the education you get. I had friends that worked 2 or 3 jobs just to finance their existence in college. And because I had the privilege of being able to live at home, and I went to college in my hometown, I could do all these incredible things that ended up leading me to work on the Hill and then work at CR and do all these amazing things. And so the indirect costs, I can just personally attest, are a huge, huge determinant in how equitable your education is. And I'm glad that DC is finally starting to talk about indirect costs, but I still haven't seen specific ideas beyond just increasing debt financing for students to address the indirect cost of college, such as rent, textbooks, food, and transportation. So if anybody on the panel could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
So I would just echo what you said. And actually in 2018, 2019, the average tuition and fees at private 4-year institutions was $35,830 compared to $48,510 when room and board was included. And then average tuition and fees at public 4-year institutions was $10,230 compared to $21,370 when room and board was included. So it just shows that when you include more than tuition and fees, equipment and other supplies, and actually include living expenses, that drastically increases. And so I think there have been some talk of allowing financial aid to extend beyond that. I mean, right now, institutions can, you get a credit balance in return if you have additional dollars once it goes towards your tuition, fees, and equipment and other supplies. And you can use that money for whatever it is that you need, but it goes hand in hand with college increasing, being way too much, students and what they have access to not being enough, and then what do you do to compensate for it in between? So it's an ongoing conversation that we are, continuing to have, and why we're having this right now, too.
And I would say I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of affordability and how we have to think beyond tuition and fees. I wouldn't discount the importance of helping people pay the actual bill, because if you can't pay the bill, then you can't be enrolled. But you've also hit on something, which is people in this country right now are suffering, and that's why we're having conversations about what the minimum wage should be, about paid sick leave, about all kinds of protections for people. And I hope that we can be thinking about this comprehensively, because students are individuals, again, in the states that they live in, the places where they live, and the social policies more broadly that make up the fabric of our, just our social systems impact whether they're able to be successful in college. This is, though, a really difficult question because you're really asking whether college students should have some benefits in that way that are above and beyond what we're providing to everybody else. And we have allowed for financial aid for years. If you have Pell that's in excess of what your tuition and fees are, that's supposed to help you pay for your living costs. I would note that I don't think there's been enough attention and statistics looking at the trend in living costs, particularly room and board, that are things, and the extent to which colleges in the same area are charging different amounts, the fact that it's not like a standard set. So I would say New Jersey's own Robert Kelchin at Seton Hall University has done some work on this in the past, and I also know Matt Chingos at, I don't know, where's Matt now, at Urban Institute, has done some look on the trends in living costs for students, which actually don't, when you look at what colleges and universities report for the non-tuition expenses of students, they have increased at a rate that is also higher than inflation. which is odd to me because those are supposed to be the things that track more so with inflation and don't necessarily have as much to do with, you know, higher education being a service-intensive industry, yada, yada, yada. But I just don't think there's been enough research on this. When I was at Lumina, we had started to fund some stuff around this. But I hope that very, very soon we do more to look at this, because that's one area where you can't really figure out what to do there. If there's something specific that's different from what's going on with society in general, which is kind of like in a bad, like we're not doing all that we can, I think, as a country on that. But if there's something specific about college students that we need to address, we need to do more research on that.
So I think, yes, all those. And I mean, cost of attendance is, you know, is a thing that federal aid should pay for. To your point about not debt financing it, I hear that, and I don't, and other than, you know, massively increasing our investment, I'm not sure what to do about that. But I will say, I think there's a sort of problem on, even on the debt financing piece, which is more and more institutions want to have the ability, and they're advocating for it very intensely in this HEA, to be able to limit loans to students who may need those loans for living costs, right? And there's some evidence that sort of shows that, I mean, there's a narrative around a lot, that I've spoken to a lot of financial aid officers about this, who just say, students are overborrowing, they're overborrowing, it's an epidemic. And then when you sort of see some of the data on what's causing students to drop out, it's for living costs. It's for, you know, a tire, like tire, not brakes, what is it called? You get a flat tire. Right. I'm clearly a car owner. And they have these expenses that are related to life, like life happens. And in some cases, it actually might help them complete if they could borrow a little bit more for that. But there are schools that don't want to give students as many loans as they're entitled to. And again, I think it's a complicated conversation, and I don't want to make it just sound like, oh, like you know, there are no students who are borrowing more than they should, but there are a lot of students who aren't borrowing enough. And I think one of the dangers in an HEA is giving schools too much discretion to limit loans to students, which I think could also have equity implications.
And the way that students could limit the colleges could limit loans to students is to have, they're the ones that set the tuition fees and the total cost of attendance. So if you think the students are borrowing too much, you should lower your.
The one HEA thing, sorry, I'm just going to get this out here, that you could do is right now, if you are a part-time student, you don't get a full-time Pell Grant, you get a part-time Pell Grant, but you can still get a full-time loan, and it seems crazy. And there's sort of legacy reasons for this that don't actually have anything to do with the policy, but I think it's sort of crazy that you would give students a part-time Pell and a full-time loan.
It costs money to
yeah.
reduce loan. Can I just say OER? We didn't mention textbook costs, but actually OER is something that you could do that would reduce at least one aspect of the non-tuition costs.
So we have time for one more question. I will just remove my moderator hat for 1 sec just to say CAP did have a plan that we put out called Beyond Tuition that was talking about these issues. So I'll put the moderator cap back on. Any final question from anybody? Yeah, right in the back.
Hi, thank you. I just actually want to follow up on that question. My name is Sammy. I work at Mazona Jewish Response to Hunger. And I was curious if anybody on the panel has looked at the GAO report about campus food insecurity. Senator Murray was one of the folks who requested it, and I was just curious if any of you have explored it or thought about, I mean, basically one quick solution to the basic needs would be getting students on SNAP. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. And you know, I guess I'm going to apologize for talking about New Jersey, but I'm not going to apologize for talking about New Jersey.
That's your job.
Because we just expanded SNAP to community college students in the state of New Jersey, and I would hope that other states explore ways to expand SNAP, and that's one of the ways that you could connect the broader, again, these are programs that are available to people in communities in general. They're part of our social welfare system, and we need to make sure that college students are not excluded. There are some states that actually exclude college students from being able to take part in these programs with the idea, I think, that, oh, they're, you know, gilded and they're like, you know, very, very privileged, and that's an old mentality of who today's students are, and we know that that's not accurate. So there's CLASP has a ton of resources on how to expand social services to college students. And it doesn't, I think, get us all the way there, just mostly because I think our social safety net in general for people is not strong enough. But for the safety net that does exist, it's like crazy that we're not doing all that we can to encourage college students to be enrolled in those things. And there's a lot of work like Single Stop and Benefits Bank and people that actually try to connect college students with the services for which they are eligible. When we rolled out our free community college program in the state of New Jersey, we had our Commissioner of Human Services who oversees kind of those social services and the social service agencies in every county, and encouraged them to think about ways to, you know, we're handling the tuition and fees portion of this in the free community college program, but how can we make sure that those students, when they are doing the intake, are connected to the services for which they are definitely already eligible by virtue of being residents and eligible for those social programs.
So we are at time, so please join me in thanking our panel, and thank you all for joining us here this afternoon.